Greetings, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield welcoming you to the podcast that explores our place in time. This is episode 150, and I am very, very delighted to share with you today the third appearance on Future Fossils by my former graduate advisor and insane genius, Sean Esbjörn-Hargens, one of the most ambitious and rigorous minds that I know, someone who has recently decided to put it all on the line, I guess in large part because he's no longer the head of an academic program and can take intellectual risks like the kind that he's taking. And to devote his formidable intellect to the problem of the UFO phenomenon and the just cornucopia of weird paranormal stuff that surrounds that phenomena. As Sean points out in this episode, as well as in his prior appearance on Future Fossils in episode 113, which I highly recommend if you want kind of a more abstract philosophical introduction to this topic, the UFO rarely shows up on its own. It's frequently appearing in conjunction with fairies, Bigfoot, ghosts, all kinds of stuff. And yet, the way that we think about these is often oversimple. People are trying to come up with a mechanical, materialist explanation for Bigfoot that ignores the UFO. And, as someone who works at the Santa Fe Institute, where transdisciplinary research is lauded and encouraged, I look at this as very similar to the way that everybody has some measure of disciplinary chauvinism in the sort of topside sciences. Physicists think that biologists aren't rigorous enough, that they're not quantitative enough. Biologists think physicists are missing something crucial about the evolutionary and systemic nature of reality. And, we just don't have time for that crap anymore. The questions that we want to answer as a species require us to get out of our silos. And Sean is just exemplary in this regard. When I first met him, he had just co-authored the book Integral Ecology with Michael Zimmerman at the University of Colorado, where he had found a framework through which to unify over 200 different disciplines of ecology. And he's done something very similar recently with his latest paper, Wild Kosmos, which is the distillation of over 650 books on the paranormal activities. And he's gotten further than anyone else I know into creating a formalized framework through which we can start investigating high weirdness in a way that, to borrow Ken Wilber's phrase, transcends and includes all of the previous modes that people have been using. So a very exciting conversation, and he's about to start an online program where he leads people through this in great depth with a honestly kind of daunting reading schedule. But before we get into one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had on Future Fossils, I want to invite listeners to check out this show's page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Michael Garfield, where I have been sharing unreleased writing and new music, some of the best stuff that I feel like I've ever done. I'm just not ready to piss it into the winds of social media quite yet. But yeah, new writing there on augmentation and cyborg anthropology, as well as some new work that's inspired by artists like Elliott Smith and Bon Iver. I'm about to drop my first ever solo acoustic guitar EP in there. If folks are into like fretboard tapping, percussive guitar stuff like Michael Hedges or Khaki King, this will be a collection of short pieces that I've written over the last 20 years and finally given a proper studio polish to. And then also we have the recordings from the Future Fossils Book Club. We're wrapping up our conversation about Lilith's Brood by Octavia Butler this Sunday. Still time to join us if you sign up. So anyway, thank you to everybody who has been supporting the show on Patreon. Your presence and the community we've created there are what motivates me to keep this show alive, demonstrates to me that it's not too weird for this world. So I want to thank new patrons Jason Murray, Jean, Leah Samuelson, and Liz Lambreau for joining up this week, and to everyone else who continues to support this program. All right, thanks everybody. Maybe I'll see you on Twitter at Michael Garfield or Instagram. If you want, email futurefossils@gmail.com and join our very thriving Discord server. And with that, I welcome back Sean Esbjörn-Hargens to talk about the unifying framework for weird phenomena. How are things?
Good, yeah, pretty good. All things considered, given this crazy COVID world we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, that's one sort of key feature that may or may not come into play in differentiating this conversation from the last conversation we had on Future Fossils. I will say that I feel like, you have probably discussed with your class, that times as weird as these, in which liminality has become a household word,
right,
I think open the conversation to weird phenomena in a way that was sort of previously foreclosed upon.
Absolutely. It's like weird has a whole new quality now. It's like weird is up close and personal. Like hanging out with my daughters 24/7 for 6 months is now in the category of weird.
Well, it's like, in a way, or to twist that, was weird before, but maybe should not have been.
Right.
And now
inverted.
Yeah. So you just got done talking to a class, right?
Yeah, we just finished up the 6-week What's Up with UFOs course. That's based on the whatsupwithufos.com website that Tom Kern and I created over a year. It took us a whole year to put that thing together. And it pulls together 150 assets, videos and articles, many of which we edited and repackaged to kind of get to the essence of what was being presented. And so all of that material is organized by 4 main categories: flying objects, hard science, direct experience, and institutional dynamics. And it takes about 5 to 7 hours to work through all the articles and videos in each of those sections. So it's about 20, 25 hours for someone to go through it all if they just sat down and did a binge. And so the course was basically an opportunity for people who are working through that content to be able to talk about it with others and to just compare notes and bring in new additional information and tidbits. And so, yeah, we just finished that up and it was awesome. We had over 100 people in the course, many of them coming from the integral community, which was great for me because it's fun to see people in that space talking about UFOs, which is weird in and of itself. So
it was. That was very much a what would you call that? Is that persona non grata or bête noire or just off the table?
Yeah,
with Ken Wilber, and I was just talking with Stuart Davis today, because he has the Aliens and Artists podcast. Yeah. I didn't get to finish your episodes, but I started listening to them. And for listeners of this show, it's worth mentioning, if you haven't listened to the first 2 episodes I did with Sean was my graduate advisor at John F. Kennedy University back in 2007 and 2008. And has thrown a number of extremely rigorous academic conferences on, multiple perspectives on like a reconstructive post-modernism. And that's where this work is situated. But like at the time that we had first encountered one another, this and sort of all other weird phenomena were just not part of that discussion. And I remember the last time I saw you at the Integral Theory Conference in 2010, you mentioned that you were just starting to put together a meta theory of fairies. Right. And that this was, and I was like, that was my first window into how truly freaky you actually are. Right. So Stuart Davis, who was a major player in that scene, also on the creative artistic side, he's like, yeah, it's so great to see Sean flying his freak flag at the top of the pole these days.
And the wind is just throwing that thing all around. It just gets more and more freakish. So, well, Michael, you're on the right path when you're going down a path that you don't recognize and that you yourself do not want to be on, but you find yourself there nonetheless. To me, that's the sign that you're actually going in the right direction.
Yeah. So, I guess that's a good place to start, because what I'd like to do this time is, we've had two very sort of free-flowing conversations, one more about your organizational work in the business world, and then one about sort of popping the question on this conversation. But since then, you've put together this extraordinary document on the wild cosmos.
Yeah.
And this document is very much a sort of academic thesis. And it is so organized and so principled that it feels like we should really, I should rise to the occasion here.
Right. And I threw the gauntlet down, Michael. Are you going to step up or what?
Yeah. So what I would like to do is really kind of go through this in the order that you're presenting it to some degree. But I think the right place to start, as I know you started with Stu, but I'm not going to let him just have this one, is to talk a little bit about the experiences that led you into this question in your own life, and why were you compelled to explore these phenomena and to leverage all of the work that you've done on an integral meta theory to try and answer some of these questions in the first place.
Yeah, great. So I was a good card-carrying integralist, and as part of that membership, I was a practicing Tibetan Buddhist and a practicing Diamond Heart student with A.H. Almas's approach. And those were two very common paths within the integral community, and partly because they're both very comprehensive and integrative in their own ways. And so they fit really well with the integral ethos, and they kind of provide a nice experiential dimension to the largely intellectual academic work that I was doing with integral theory and meta theory in general. And I was very happy in both of those traditions. I felt like I was home, that I would be there for the rest of my spiritual practicing days. And saw no reason why I would shift out of just deepening my engagement with both of those traditions. Then my daughter was born, and I'm sure you can relate to this in your own ways, how that becomes a wrecking ball in and of itself, where life starts changing. So as a result of being a new dad with a young daughter, we were not able to attend all of the, weekly, the weekend retreats and the annual retreats that we'd been doing. And so I stopped formally practicing in both of those traditions. But I'm at heart a seeker, and like to think of myself as a very serious meditator and practitioner. So I was left with kind of this existential spiritual void. And what started happening in that space, though, was I started noticing my interest in nature spirits, and how I'd always had an interest in nature spirits and elemental beings and the subtle intelligences associated with the natural world, because, as we talked about in prior episodes, my work in integral ecology, I've just spent a lot of time outdoor education, and doing a PhD in environmental studies, essentially. So I decided to follow this impulse, what I would equate to a soul impulse. And I basically said, all right, I'm going to give myself 10 years to really go down this path of working with fairy beings and elementals and devas, and see what's there. I'm going to do the hermeneutic, and I'm going to try and connect with the community of the adequate, and understand, like, what are people experiencing when they're working in these subtle spaces, and what are the realities and how do they discern between what they're experiencing and, consensual reality, and how do they verify these different types of beings and all of that. And as I began that process, it's because in the integral space, like talking about magic or hermetics or the occult is just not part of that discourse so much. So I felt very much kind of out of sorts with exploring it. But the more I went into it, the more I found I was having experiences that for me were true and interesting and provocative. And so there was something there, and I wanted to keep exploring it. And so the more I went into the inner earth, as it were, the more I was popping out the other side into the galactic realms and having encounters and experiences that I would think of as more extraterrestrial or extra dimensional. And this was like it's one thing to talk about fairies, it's another thing to talk about fairies and aliens. It's like you're just going farther and farther out on the limb. You hear the limb creaking. You're wondering about your wellness, and
the limb is a Mobius strip.
Right, exactly. But it's like at a certain point you just have to go for it. And so I ended up having a set of experiences over these years that I didn't know how to reconcile, because I was, on the one hand, having encounters with subtle beings I would associate with the natural world. And on the other hand, I was having encounters and experiences with subtle beings that I associate with the galactic realm. And this was confusing, because when you're hanging out with the UFO folks, they don't really want to talk about aliens unless they're equating, they don't want to talk about fairies unless they're equating them with aliens. And when you hang out with the fairy folk, they don't really want to talk about the UFO folks or, aliens, because they don't want fairies to be reduced to just modern day aliens, right? So you're in like two different groups of spiritual practice, in a sense, that really don't want anything to do with each other. And so I was being drawn and quartered by this. So of course my meta mind pops up and it's like, all right, let's start figuring this out. Like, what the hell's going on? Like, how do we make sense of these subtle realms and these different types of encounters with non-human intelligences? And that brings us to this point where I've written this 50-page article that kind of provides an initial offering as to some distinctions that might be useful with understanding some of those spaces.
Yeah, and just to kind of make an observation about this that I felt has always been a kind of a semantic issue with integral philosophies, plural. It really is about making these distinctions, and so it's sort of counter to a mathematical integral. Like it's a differential, but then, as you mention in a list of characteristics about this class or these classes of phenomena, one of them is about the sort of Mobius strip nature of this. And so, that was for me always the question that I felt was unaddressed, really, or insufficiently addressed by the work of people like Ken Wilber, which is what lies at the heart, or like in the center of his like 4-quadrant model. And like it's not enough to just simply casually be like, oh, well, we don't have language for that. Right. And we discussed this a little bit in the last episode, this notion that there needs to be a more rigorous ontology and epistemology to, and we've got to find a way to join them. And I think you're doing this in this work. So it's I guess maybe the correct place to start would be to talk a little bit about your move to try and offer a more intricate and helpful taxonomy for these phenomena, which are just, as you've kind of already mentioned, so incredibly diverse that it has been difficult in the community studying them to try and settle on one answer that works for all of these different phenomena. And like in the last time you were on the show, we talked a little bit about this, the case study that you provide in this paper on the Skinwalker Ranch, right. And which is just like a cornucopia of like seemingly random, weird stuff that just consistently challenges any efforts at categorization. So how are you coming at this now let's talk about some of those distinctions that you're making.
Great. And I like to think of it as my project, in a sense, is one of trying to provide expressive capacity. Like, what are useful distinctions that allow us to have conversations that we're not able to have without those distinctions, that actually gets us closer to the truth? All right. Should I repeat that?
No, actually, I think that was kind of, I don't know, that was like a highlighter on what you were saying there.
Okay, good. Nice. Some synchronicity here, being supported by the universe. And for me, I love Skinwalker Ranch as a case study because it very quickly gets us right in the heart of the question, what is reality? Like, what is going on here? Like, how is this possible? Like, how can you have UFO sightings, Bigfoot sightings, poltergeists, aports, material objects disappearing and showing up in other places, all of these things and more, in a way that seemingly seems real, right? Like, if you combine it with other research, with other paranormal hotspots, it's not that these are hallucinations. These are actual real experiences that are occurring, and many people are having them. So starting from there, it's kind of like, I feel like all hands on deck. And so I'm not just satisfied with the literature and the UFO space. And so I then go to the academic space, I go to the paranormal and esoteric space, I go to the space studies. So part of the approach that I'm developing with exostudies is metadisciplinary, in that I'm drawing on over 150 different disciplines and have a reading list of 650 books that I'm drawing on to try and make sense of all of this. And like, what are the new approaches to animism have to say? What are the new approaches to feminist views on materialism have to say? What does the ontological turn in anthropology give us to better understand this dynamic? What are some of the more interesting emergent theories of quantum mechanics and how it interfaces with consciousness have to say? What's the leading edge of understanding the role conspiratorial psychology plays in belief formation, and how that then interferes with our ways of interpreting phenomenon? So it's kind of like, and it's endless. Like, there's so many, and the year-long program that I'm starting in September has 42 topics that we're going into kind of in this way. And really at the heart of it is like, what's up with reality? Like, how can we make sense of these phenomena? And part of it is like, I love the work of Jack Hunter, who is bringing a paranormal approach to anthropology. And he has this concept of ontological flooding, which is essentially taking at face value what's being reported to you by witnesses, or indigenous people, or people who are saying something that otherwise seems like impossible, and assuming that what they're saying actually is more or less the truth and it is real. And so starting from that place, and then bringing kind of a sophisticated, scientific, intellectual approach, opposed to what's more common, which is the phenomenological bracketing, where you bracket out any claim to truth or reality or the thing in itself, and just kind of talk about our experience or perception of phenomena. I'm interested in like pushing the boundary and actually saying, let's make some ontological claims. Let's actually talk about what reality is and how can we do that? Because to me, it's not a question of whether these things are real or unreal. It's like, what do we mean when we say they're real? Like, in what sense are they real? And this, one of the entry points for this in the article is the whole issue of entity encounters, right? Because when you go into the abduction literature, for instance, there's 5 main types of beings that show up over and over again. You have mantis beings or insectoids. You have the tall and short grays, or sometimes tall whites, but you have human-looking entities, and you have the reptoids, or reptilians that show up on a regular basis. So in the abduction scenarios, you often have, people encountering 2, 3, 4, or all 5 of those types of beings. When people are on DMT, it's not uncommon for them to also encounter all of those beings and more, right? And then they're also encountering machine elves. Then when you go into the fairy lore and you look at the descriptions of the gnomes and the fairies and the elementals, they're described differently than the machine elves but there's enough similarity that you start, and I've heard ayahuascan shamans talk about the gray showing up in the sacred circle, and they just tell the grays to go away because this isn't for them, right? So what you start to discover in the encounter literature is people are encountering the same kind of set of beings across all these categories, right? And so it just raises this issue of like, what are these subtle realms and how are they overlapping? And how is it that people who are having out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, psychedelic experiences, meditation experiences, lucid dream experiences, that the phenomenological descriptions that are occurring across those literatures are pointing to a highly inhabited wild cosmos, right? And that there's some consistencies and there's some interesting differences across that space that to me lends to the point where I have to take very seriously that we're surrounded by all kinds of intelligences that we don't normally see or understand or know how best to communicate with or interact with, right? And so the meta approach is trying to get a sense of like, why is no one drawn on the history of philosophy and our philosophical tools around ontological analysis, epistemological and methodological analysis to kind of triangulate to say something useful about the paranormal? Because it seems to me the paranormal provides us a direct path into starting to answer and engage some of these big questions about what is the nature of reality. And so why has the paranormal been left off the table in any initiative to try and understand reality? And so that's kind of the core impulse that's coming through me.
Yeah, just a couple thoughts that this brings up. One is that the process that you're describing here of humility in asking these questions, and what you call ontological flooding.
Yeah.
That there's Jeremy Narby's very popular account, The Cosmic Serpent, where he's an anthropologist going down into the Amazon and the tribal peoples of the Amazon whom he is there to help preserve their knowledge so that they can basically register it as intellectual property and protect themselves against corporations that are trying to harvest their knowledge for various reasons. The story that he keeps getting from them is that they're like, "Oh, how did you figure out that the plant was good for treating this particular condition?" And they're like, "Oh, the plant told me."
Right.
And he's like, "No, that can't be." And that's really one very well referenced example of how profound a difference it makes when you're able to free yourself of this. I think a lot of people don't recognize specifically, but for sure is a like colonial mindset where it's not just about taking someone's land, it's about taking their account of reality and replacing it with your own. And then, this is on display. This always annoyed me. This is on display really quite fiercely with a statement that Richard Dawkins made about Our Lady of Fatima and how, he's like, well, obviously it was a mass hallucination, because science, and he said in Unweaving the Rainbow, which is otherwise a very, very excellent book, but there was that one line in there where he says, it is not the onus of empirical science to address these questions. And so, there's this whole thing about, in the community of the Brights, this sort of scientistic scene that we have now, that there is not even wrong, because it's not, you cannot subject it to an empirical methodology. But I don't think that's right, actually. I think you make a really good case, and many others do. You reference Jeff Kripal in this a lot. You reference there's lots of this, like you said, like 650 books. But some of these folks that have started to sort of make a name for themselves in an emerging academic, like rigorous academic discipline around the weird, including my buddies, Phil Ford and JF Martel, Weird Studies podcast, are doing a really good job of pulling on these threads.
And JF was just on Stewart's podcast.
Yeah, I need to listen to that one too. So there is, I think you point to something really important here, which is that we don't actually know what the limits of empiricism are here, because if we foreclose, there's something that I've had this model for years about. It was just sort of based on my studies with you about the and the paper that you wrote with Ken Wilber on on the developmental levels of scientific methodology, and how like Zen counts as science, but that it's employing a different allowable data set in its practice. And that, so I thought about how, in a way, fundamentalist religion is a sort of science, but the only admissible data is whatever's inside the sacred text, and everything else is thrown out. And then we get to the rational enlightenment, and that data set is the so-called five senses. But then anything beyond, anything that might be in the like 16 senses as recognized by Michael Murphy's Future of the Body does not count. There's 11 senses that you're just throwing out. And part of this has to do with, I think, this balance between I guess I think about it in like computing terms, that there is only so much that someone can hold at a time. There are metabolic costs, and Eric Davis has talked about this, about that when he talks about metabolic ontology, that what he's saying is that access to an expanded consciousness through a meditative practice or a psychedelic experience affords us a window of opportunity in which we are able to allow additional evidence, because we have access to sort of more computing cycles or something. And so it seems like we're at a point in history where the threshold there is the point at which you stop allowing evidence, is the point at which a story precipitates, and we fall back into a sort of narrative mythic structuring of things. And so anyway, I think I have a lot of hope, is to like tie a bow on this. I have a lot of hope that the more nuanced and sophisticated and multidimensional our analyses, the greater the access to information. You're like a living example of this. The more obvious it is that patterns are not just anomalous and can be dismissed, and the more we can come together in sort of collective computations, socially on this issue. The scope of what we consider modern science is going to expand to include a lot of stuff that it previously denied. And the question, I do not believe that not even wrong is a fixed point, basically. And so at any rate, that's my way of ramping into your very nuanced distinctions around, as you've already said, what is real, what is an object, and then what is evidence. And I would love for you to pull these apart and show them off for people in the order that you present them in this text.
Great, cool. Yeah, so a couple of things to set the stage. Part of what I'm interested in is, Philip de Scala has written a book called Beyond Culture and Nature, and he's an anthropologist, French, done his work in the Amazonia. And in it, he presents a typology of four major ontologies. And one of them is the kind of naturalism, which is kind of our Western view that there's one singular nature and there's many subjectivities, which is kind of the view that there's all these different interiorities that are then kind of looking at the same nature. Right. And and so this gives rise to what we think of as kind of, modern scientific focus on the singular nature, and the postmodern focus on kind of cultural relativity and so forth. What he points out is that that's just one particular ontological story or way of making sense of the relationship between the one and the many. In the animist traditions, it's inverted, where there is a singular interiority Everything has interiority. Everything is a person, or most things, many things have personhood. But there are many bodies and many worlds, right? So in that context, there's not a singular nature. There's multiple ontologies or multiple worlds and realities, but everyone has, agency and personhood. And so it's almost the exact opposite, and in many ways is the direct opposite set of polarities than what our kind of Western naturalism presents. And then there's two other ontologies, and I won't get into those. But the point is, when you read that work and you realize that there's these four major different ways of kind of dividing the one in many pie into different ontological, epistemological understandings, and that the Western one is just one of four, then I go, what's the meta-ontology? Like, how are all of these, what are all of these an expression of? Like, and how do we get at that? Like, how do we talk about that? And part of what I love about the UFO space and the paranormal space is there's a way in which I almost situate it in the center of this typology, because the phenomena shows up, and sometimes it shows up as a naturalistic ontology, sometimes it shows up as an animistic ontology, sometimes it shows up as the other two ontologies. And so it's like the phenomena doesn't adhere to just our Western scientific naturalist view of things. And that's why it's so confusing, and that's why it's so disorienting, and why it gets set aside. But I feel like these are the breadcrumbs of weirdness that lead us down the path in the forest to actually finding the hut, right? And opening the door and discovering who or what is in the hut, right? And so I'm having to kind of revamp, what do we mean by evidence? Because the UFO phenomena has what I call doubleness, or you could say tripleness. But the idea is that it contains paradoxical qualities simultaneously. And examples of that is that it appears inside and outside. It's dreamlike, but it leaves physical trace evidence. It's like, and so it's trickster. It's Mobius. It has all these qualities that confuse us because we're trying to adhere to this scientific naturalist orientation. When you look at and so there's this paradox where you'll have people in the UFO community say there's a lot of evidence. And then you have people like Richard Dawkins saying there's no evidence or all hallucination, right? And the Fatima example is interesting because it's one of the most well-documented examples of a paranormal event that's like, I don't even know how you could even talk about it as a hallucination if you really look at the historical data around it. But anyways,
the burden of trying to explain that scientifically is actually quite great. It's understandable that one would shrink from such a responsibility.
For sure. And so I found, as I looked at like what are the different definitions of evidence, that when you look at a court of law, there's like over a dozen different kinds of evidence that can be used to prosecute, right? And when you look at the scientific method, there's like 3 or 4 or 5 different kinds of evidence that are often talked about, like at a meta level, kind of. And what I've noticed is that in terms of UFO evidence and extraterrestrial evidence, there is a ton of legal evidence. Like tons of it. It's like, so like if I had to take this case to court, like, I think I would win, like, with a fair, impartial jury. Like the exhibit A through 1000 is so, there's so much evidence that it's just like case closed. But then it's interesting because when you get to scientific evidence, it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to make the case that there's scientific evidence because the phenomenon doesn't adhere to a lot of the protocols of the scientific method in the ways that we would like. Like it doesn't repeat itself. Like it doesn't do well in laboratory settings. So there's a way in which it's asking us to up-level our scientific game, right? So I find it's an interesting kind of gap that there's so much legal evidence and not as strong scientific evidence. And so I think we have to re-envision what we mean by evidence. So I'm working on kind of a typology of evidence to show all the different kinds of evidence there are and which kinds there are less of. Because, basically when someone like, Dawkins says there's no evidence, they're pointing to one of like 20 different types of evidence that, they're talking about a publicly verifiable, repeatable kind of evidence. And yeah, in that sense, it's fair to say there's no evidence, right? Or at least that's a respectable position. But when you look at all the other kinds of evidence, legally and scientific, there's tons, right? There's psychological evidence, there's anthropological evidence, there's archaeological evidence, there's physics evidence, there's first-person testimony, there's sociological evidence. The list goes on. And so it's so fascinating that the taboo around this topic is such that we're not able to more systematically investigate and explore these dynamics.
Well, just as a kind of pin into this, because I'm living now in the mothership, if you will, of complex system science, right, at SFI, this is also part of why it has been so difficult for SFI and complexity science in general to click with the incumbent scientific community, because when we're talking about, not even weird or paranormal phenomena, but simply complex phenomena that are dependent, sensitive to initial conditions, are they're path dependent, on like the way that they unfold in time, has they're at multiple scales. So, the level of granularity at which you examine the phenomena determines, your ability to understand it. And, lots of stuff is sort of below the threshold of our ability to actually observe and record things. And so you end up where the principal methodology of complex system science is modeling or simulation. And this is not, this is not a reproducible in the way that is comfortable to the way that we have been taught about science in high school, even though it's extraordinarily practical. And this kind of gets back to this sort of indigenous ways of knowing, and like the curandero's approach to what is real and what is evidence, right? Because it's, there's a pragmatism here, which, again, you call on William James very early in this, and his approach to ontological pluralism, which I think we might have discussed on the last time you were on the show, but this, it's about, there's a way in which you can reproduce the conditions of an agent-based model, and then you can run it twice on two different computers, and you can get similar enough results that you can say, okay, this is workable in the real world. And this is what's going on right now with the coronavirus pandemic. We have people working with the CDC that are using extremely dense, high-dimensional simulations. And this is sort of, if you will, the sort of the Cain and Abel or Christ and Set of the children of science, the split family tree here. One is complex system science, and the other is machine learning. And machine learning has a very similar, but kind of like reciprocal problem, which is that we know it works, but we don't know how. And so at any rate, I think that it's important, I think, to understand that, like, when this is not a class of phenomena to which these problems are unique. And it's also the case that, like, you talk a lot about the sort of mind matter piece of this, and like we're facing an extreme reproducibility crisis in psychology right now, also, so this is in a way, I feel like the work that you're doing is giving all of these other sort of more conventional disciplines better ground to stand on, or like it's giving people a way to address problems in science that are not merely problems about the UFO phenomenon or ghosts or Bigfoot, but are problems about the human mind and are problems about the way that we think about, like you have already said, simply the way that we classify reality, so
totally. And I'm glad you're making this connection, because I think there's a lot of links between the complexity sciences and how they just boggle the minds of kind of more traditional mainstream types of scientific investigation. And you're right. It's almost like by going into the heart of the weird, and trying to figure out how do we say something meaningful about it, and how do we need to change our scientific approach to match the phenomenon and not try and force the phenomenon into the categories and constraints of easy science. That by doing that and kind of figuring that out, I think you're absolutely right. It gives a lot of kind of more, mainstream, but like the complexity sciences as a great example, more mainstream approaches to challenges, a lot of tools from which to, further their own efforts. And this is particularly important in a post-truth era that we're in, right? Like, it's interesting with climate change. Climate change is really abstract. And so you can kind of understand why people would be denying it and fighting about it and going back and forth, because it requires a capacity for a time horizon that a lot of people just don't have. But when you talk about the coronavirus, and I see these articles, every few days about some person who has just died from the virus, who 2 months ago posted on their Facebook page that it was a hoax, right? And so there's consequences, right? So like, how do we develop a more sophisticated, integrative meta-science of the paranormal such that it actually helps all these other approaches to scientific, initiatives that are struggling with, kind of fitting into the old school scientific paradigm, which is so broken and has been so discredited, and yet somehow we're still culturally committed to it in some bizarre way.
Yeah, so, we can't have this conversation without tipping our glasses raising our glasses, tipping our hats to Charles Fort. And, you bring up his notion from the 1920s of ontological indeterminacy, which takes the position that nothing is real, but that nothing is unreal.
Yeah.
All phenomena are approximations one way or the other between realness and unrealness. So you use this as a way of opening up an exploration of what is real, and you offer a couple or a handful of sort of subtler distinctions. I guess this is Brian Sentis' fourfold distinction, and so this is I think worth addressing here.
Yeah. So and it's interesting because it started with my climate change paper in 2010 on the ontology of climate change, where in that context, I'm looking at the notion of multiple ontologies and the idea that climate change is like a hyper object, a la, Timothy Morton, and that it's such a different kind of object that we can't think of it in a typical kind of singular, simple location sense. And that it's such a big dynamic object that transcends time and space in unique ways, that different methodologies in measuring climate change from one vantage point or another kind of enact a subset of the total reality labeled climate change. And therefore you sometimes get, meteorologists and oceanographers and sociologists talking about and relating to climate change very differently. And sometimes you even wonder if they're talking about the same thing, right? And so in trying to understand all the debate around whether or not climate change is happening or not, that actually took me down the road of trying to understand the notion of ontological multiplicity, and like, how might we expand from requiring a singular ontology to how do we talk about multiple ontologies, and what does that mean? Does that mean we're all living in different worlds, or are they overlapping in different ways? Or how do we enact and call forward different ontological realities based on our psychology and our history and our karma and our methods and our way of being in the world? So Charles Fort's very fascinating in this because of his whole idea of ontological indeterminacy really resonated with me, that this phenomenon is both subjective and objective. It's both imaginal and physical. It's like, as Kripal talks about a mythical object, and a mythical object is basically a story that has a physical dimension to it. It's one way to think about it. So it's like, imagine a Jungian archetype as a UFO that somehow is able to generate radar returns. So it's simultaneously kind of a psychosocial phenomenon, but it has such power that it's showing up in our physical world and leaving physical traces in a way that's very confusing to us. So Fort talks about this idea that this phenomenon is basically kind of moving in and out of reality. It's kind of like manifesting and dematerializing, and that all phenomenon is on this continuum of real and unreal. And that, and so this opened me up to thinking about making sense of the exophenomenon this way. Though I add a twist to Fort's thing, which And instead of having unreal on one end and real on the other, I came up with 3 spectrums and trying to kind of put a little meat on the 40 and bones of what that spectrum might look like. And so I created 3 spectrums. One is what I call the ontological stations spectrum, which are like 4 different realms or realities from subjective to objective, with intersubjective and interobjective in the middle. So this is one spectrum, and different beings are born or originate in different realms, and they can actually move across that spectrum in different directions, right? So you can have a thought form, right, that starts out in the subjective realm, and through occult practice and ritual and concentration and intentionality, that thought form can actually become an intersubjective being that other people experience and interact with, a la the experiment Conjuring Philip that occurred, back in the day. And then, these tupas, to use a Tibetan term for them, actually can then, in a sense, manifest in the real world and even have physical expression. And then you have to bring in like kind of a crisis team of occultists to basically mentally deconstruct this phenomena so that it stops running around causing problems, right? So it's an example of something that starts in the mind and literally becomes a manifest physical being of some sort. Then what's interesting, so you have this one spectrum. The other spectrum is what I call ontological sovereignty, or the free will spectrum, that goes from non-autonomous to semi-autonomous to autonomous, right? So a tulpa, for instance, starts out non-autonomous. It's basically a creation of your own powerful imagination. But there's experiences and examples that seems to suggest that they become semi-autonomous or possibly even completely autonomous in some sense. You can think of the work of Aleister Crowley and with Lamb and some of these things, and like calling in and evoking these, so then you have the spectrum of from non-autonomous to autonomous. The third spectrum is what I call the ontological substance or density spectrum, which is basically about the body. Are they a light body? Or are they a subtle energetic body? Or are they a physical body? Now, we generally, in kind of contemporary consensual culture, we identify what's real as being on one end of each of these spectrums. It's objective. It comes from an objective context. It's autonomous. And it's gross and physical in its body. So this is, in a sense, kind of what we generally mean by something's real. If something's subjective, non-autonomous, or causal or energetic, it's not real. So in that sense, my spectrum is like real and real, opposed to Fort's, which is unreal and real. So all 3 of these spectrums are real to real, but it's like, so it's just as real if it's subjective, semi-autonomous, and subtle energetic as if it's a causal light, autonomous, objective being. So it gives us a matrix, an ontological matrix, to start to have a different conversation about light orbs turning into Sasquatch, right? Or Sasquatch turning into light orbs, or ET craft being physical and then turning into some energetic phenomenon and then zipping out in a blink of an eye. Because I feel like we don't have a good way of talking about in what ways are these things real and not real. And to me, it's not that they're not real. They all are real. It's more about how do we have a set of distinctions that allows us to talk about the ways they are real. Because if you even use like James's notion of truth, of pragmatic truth, that these things have causal effect. They're interacting and influencing the world and yourself, right? So in that theory of truth, they're all real, right? So I really want to get out of the binary that we're stuck in with, Western Civ, and kind of the real unreal, because if you really do the ontological flooding practice and you take serious what these indigenous cosmologies are telling us, you take serious the 500,000 people who have had abduction experiences, you take serious the, hundreds of thousands of people who have had, physical encounters with Sasquatch, if you really open yourself up to what that material is telling us, then you have to say that, wow, fairies are real, aliens are real, and angels are real. And then it's kind of like, holy shit, well, what's not real? Like, it's almost as if everything that we think is not real actually is real. And then it gets really interesting and very fun and exciting to go, like, we live in a wild cosmos that's inhabited by multitudes of intelligences that we only barely have a sensibility around.
Yeah. So, listening to you talk about this, I've had a couple of deep conversations with folks over the years about what I would call like kind of mundane examples of what you're talking about. I think it was in Futurama, the cartoon, where I'm trying to remember if this is where I heard this. They were talking about how there's an argument that Batman is more real than you, Sean Hargens, because Batman, in the Tim Morton sense, as a quote unquote hyper object, is something that has a greater spatiotemporal extension and greater mass. All of the Batman merchandise that's ever been made, and so like Batman is, or the Jeff Kripal thing about a mythic object, that you just described. This is something that originated in the mind of one person and then became more autonomous as it seeded mimetically into other people and developed into this thing. And we're seeing this now. This is a really interesting twist in the turn that pop culture has taken over the last few decades, where like we're seeing this with Star Trek now, for example, where it went from being one, maybe two television shows at a time to now they're talking about putting on like something like 6 concurrent TV shows with different showrunners. And so everyone is taking this ball and running with it in a different direction and bringing their own life and mind to it and giving it something else. And it's becoming a much more heterogeneous phenomenon than it used to be. It's much less the province of Gene Roddenberry and whoever he sort of bequeaths as trustworthy to handle this, the phenomenon of fan fiction, and so there's a sense in which arguably a way that you're not, in a way more real, you've kind of just demolished that. But there's ways in which we're getting different kinds of real when something moves into the fanverse. Or moves, we're sort of authorizing fan fiction. And so there's like a kind of like imaginal genocide that Disney commits when they destroy the Star Wars extended universe, when they take over the property and they say, no, we're going to de-Pinocchio this. Right. We're going to make this ours again. And you don't get to, your stories are non-canonical and they don't even exist anymore. But there's another piece which, this is more of the, in keeping with your meditation practice and, the conversation in like Neo-Advaita Vedanta, where, the self is regarded as a fiction. Yeah. And so, when we're talking about things being both real or like real in the conventional way and fictional, then what we're talking about includes, I think, fairly conclusively and rigorously, and in a way that modern science is not ignoring and is not dismissing, the ego, the personality, the sense that, we are now completely comfortable in Silicon Valley talking about this as a sort of illusion. And so we see, I think it's like part of why we see so many tech billionaires engaged in these Ozymandian projects, like Bezos and Blue Origin. Like, if I can seed the cosmos, if I can be the linchpin at the bottleneck of our extraplanetary history, then I'm somehow more real. Yeah. It's part of that sort of on that immortality project that the ego has always been engaged in. And so I think that, your framework, again, is not just applicable to paranormal phenomena, but it reveals the ways in which the things that we take for granted as the mundane, unquestionable everyday realities are themselves kind of paranormal. Yeah.
Absolutely. And this is why I love Kripal. He does such a great job of highlighting the ways in which what you write can take on a life of its own. He talks about authors of the impossible. And if you just look at like Keel's book, Mothman Prophecies, he gives an example early in that book of an author who wrote a ton of stories. And one of the main characters that shows up across the stories is called the Shadow. And the Shadow always wears a long coat and a hat, dark, brimmed hat, and is always in the shadows. And so what's interesting is after the author moves out of that house where he wrote a lot of the books, then people move into that house and they basically start describing a ghost-like figure. They had no idea who lived there before and what that person did. but they start describing a shadow-like figure who's basically haunting the house. And so the question then starts to come, it's like, did this author write that character into existence? Like, is that essentially a tupa, right? And so your point about Batman is like, this is what we're talking about, that Batman is real, right? And it's like in a number of different ways, because one of the things that comes out of the occult traditions is that when there's enough collective awareness around something, it creates its own kind of reality. And so if you take the work of J.R.R. Tolkien in Middle-earth, that two things. One, there seems to be good reason that he tapped into either the Middle-earth history on the fourth dimension of our Earth, and basically was channeling that in a sense, or he was tapping into the galactic elves on Syria and was channeling that. And so there's a way in which he's actually describing a real reality in some other dimension. And then it's obviously getting filtered through his literary prose, but it's essentially a finger pointing to a real moon, right? So there's the truth of Tolkien's world in that sense, right? And then there's also the ways in which, because of the cultural phenomena like Batman you were talking about, we've actually collectively created Middle-earth as a subtle dimension that actually exists. And people have had experiences going there and interacting with beings and some of the characters that are there. So we bring these
Frodo lives.
I know, it does. As does Sauron, so you gotta be careful. So it's like, this is where the literal becomes literal, right? The literary becomes literal, right? So we are dealing with more dynamic domains of consciousness than we realize. Like, there's a lot more interesting things going on than what we often realize. And we're also this interesting moment, like with Musk taking us to Mars in the next 10 years. Like, we're becoming a galactic human, right? And the full extent of what that implies and means, like, we're not even really aware of, but it's creeping up on us. Like, in 10 years, we're going to be terraforming Mars, so we're going to have a base on the moon. It's like, we're being confronted with galactic consciousness, and part of galactic consciousness is coming to terms with our galactic history. And when you look at our galactic history as a species, it gets really bizarre, really fascinating, really overwhelming. Right? Because there's a lot of good reasons to think that we are a hybridization project of dozens of different intelligences, and that Earth-like humans go back millions of years to a number of different star systems, and we're just one colony out of many, in a sense, right? And there's a lot more to say, but when you just start opening up your mind to these possibilities, again, the whole real, not real, it's like, it just doesn't make any more sense. So it's kind of like, how do we become epistemologically reflexive, have methodologies that are pragmatic, and have an ontology that can match the diversity of experiences and realities that we seem to be encountering?
Yeah, I want to linger for a moment on, you brought up the post-truth reality.
Yeah.
And fans of this show have heard me talk about this novel, Charles Stross's Accelerando, numerous times. I think it's just a remarkably astute and prophetic work of science fiction. And one of the things that happens in the third act of the book is that humans who have been driven off planet by our artificial intelligences optimizing for computing power and have basically devoured Earth and replaced it with, computers that are creating some giant, transcendent, ineffable simulation. We were basically refugees at the edge of the solar system, and people start showing up from the inner solar system to our refugee camp that are not us, that are like historically, they're either historical figures like Abraham Lincoln, or it's like Spider-Man, or, and there's like a whole, when you arrive at the human colony at the edge of our solar system, you get a message. You have like there's like a an Ellis Island where it's like, if you suspect yourself of being a fictional character, please report yourself to city authorities. And so I was just thinking about this in terms of episode 91 of the show is like the one I talk about the most, about an oral history of the end of reality and deep fakes, and this question of the machine-driven tulpa The idea that, just today I found a website. I mean, I think a lot of people have probably already heard of thispersondoesnotexist.com, where they're doing seemingly photographs of faces that are actually just generated by adversarial networks. Yeah. And so it looks convincingly like somebody that I would try to like hit on, but she has never existed in like flesh and blood. Yeah. But then of course it's easy to imagine, in 100 years that you can 3D print her. Yeah. And this is why I got stuck on Blade Runner 2049 for as long as I did with this show. But like just today, I saw another website called thisworddoesnotexist.com, which is words that are, this computationally sounds much easier, but it's just conlanging, like neologisms that were generated by machine learning networks. And some of them are extremely on point. A lot of it's just noise and garbage, but a lot of it is words that I can imagine being taken up into the English language, and actually used. And I was sending it to some friends that, that have indulged with me over the years in both weird phenomena, extraterrestrial sightings and so on, as well as this kind of recombinant, like the synthesis of new molten terrain upon which we may one day culturally stand. So it's like, there's another piece of it, which I think this really gets to the heart of what you're talking about here, because, you'd look at all of the 10 different hypotheses you identify as, having dominated the paranormal and UFO discourse. Yeah. And then you synthesize an 11th, the mutual enactment hypothesis, which I think, allows us to start to think seriously about what happens when the machines dream up a new reality for us to inhabit, or where, we ourselves, you give some examples of, a class of encounters where people are reporting that their conversations with these strange entities are that we are ghosts haunting them, and so like this is the sort of infinity loop I want to go into here with you now.
Yeah, and this brings us back to the fourfold kind of notion of the real that you mentioned from Brian Senti's work, and he builds that off of a number of other philosophers. And his blog is, Skunkworks. And so definitely check out his stuff. It's great. He pulls together kind of from a number of different people, this 4 different words: the real, lowercase, the real, uppercase, the hyper-real, and the hypo-real. And the real is just our everyday, take it for granted consensus reality, right? Whereas the real with capital R is essentially, intrusions on the real lowercase, such as a UFO or encounter with a non-human intelligence that really radically alters our worldview, and kind of is a game changer for us, right? So this is kind of like the paranormal kind of, intruding into your kind of lazy Sunday and just kind of, rocking your world. And then the hyper-real, and this also kind of builds on the work of Robbie Graham, who wrote a book, The Silver Saucers and the UFOs, where he's looking at the relationship between media and UFOs and sightings and kind of this recursive loop. And the hyper-real is where the relationship between the original and the copy kind of gets inverted, and you can no longer tell the difference between them, or the copy becomes more real than the original. And like, there's this great example given of this woman who sees JFK, walking along like in this kind of, presidential situation. And she says something like, he looks as handsome as his picture. Right. So this is just an example of like where it's like what's real is the picture. So he looks as handsome as his picture, right? So he's the copy, right? So, and we find this in the UFO space where people watch a movie with UFOs in it. And on the one hand, they know it's fake because they know they're at the movies. On the other hand, they know it's real because they saw it in a movie. So there's a way in which seeing it in the movie reinforces both your sense that it's fake and your sense that it's real, right? And so this is part of the doubleness and this is kind of like the matrix, right? And kind of what you're pointing to in this poster is like, it's both. It's both more real and more fake, because I saw it in a movie and the way it kind of goes into our mental processing. And then also there's a way in which real UFO sightings have influenced what goes into the movies. And then the movies that we watch influence how we interpret and make sense of real UFO sightings, right? So then you have these cognitive and cultural frames, and this is part of the mutual enactment hypothesis. So it's not that it's more dynamic than saying like there's a real UFO, right? And then I'm viewing it as a person on the ground and seeing it like it's a singular object in the sky. It's much more interesting than that. It's like somehow I'm participating and experiencing myself as the UFO, viewing me, and I'm both the UFO and I'm not, and the UFO is a physical, real object, and it's imaginal, subtle, energetic phenomena that's in part created by the collective consciousness of the whole planet, and it also has beings in it from, some nearby solar system, right? And so it's kind of like it's somehow all of those things. It's like a multidimensional object, and so you can't just reduce it to like a nuts and bolts craft in the sky. That we are deeply in participation. We are mutually enacting the UFO, and the UFO is mutually enacting us. Like we're a projection of the UFO. Like we're a simulation that the UFO is creating, and we're creating the UFO as so there's a much more interesting topography, I believe, around the relationship between mind and matter, between the I, we, and it, between self and other, that it's a much more dynamic ontological dance than what we've come to realize. And part of what I'm wanting to do is like get in there and play and explore that. And then the other one is the hypo-real that Sentis talks about, which is where an original object or phenomenon, is not amendable to current representations, right? And does not conform to our individual reference points. So this is like things like hyper-reality, like people on DMT will talk about things being more real in that space than this space. Like so that's interesting. Somehow they're in an altered state, which is a hallucination, but they're having the experience that something is more real than when they come back to this particular simulation. So that's interesting. And then also it's like these phenomena are so strange, we don't know how to make sense of it, so we fill in the blanks. So then you get screen memories where someone has a bizarre encounter with a gray alien, and what they remember is they hit a deer on the road with their car, and they drove off the road, and they're missing an hour of time because of this accident, when in fact, like, they got abducted, but they're having a screen memory because they're trying to process the weirdness of it, right? So there's a way in which the hypo-real is basically when we experience something, we just don't have a reference point, and so it's hypo-real, and then we're kind of filling in the blanks cognitively.
Yeah, this feels like personal sharing time now.
Oh, good.
Yeah, because I don't know if I ever told you this story, but I've definitely brought it up in episode 37 when I was talking to my buddy Michelangelo, where he called me.
The guy who did the painting?
No, not that one. He's the ungoogleable Michelangelo. Is Michael Jacobs, who has a great podcast called Self Portraits as Other People, where he's an actor, and so he takes on all sorts of different identities. He had Stuart Davis on, and they had an awesome conversation about embodying multiple different versions of like diffracted selves in their creative projects. He's one of these sort of spectral, almost like Jim Carrey or Robin Williams-esque people who can just sort of shift through personae. And anyway, he and I were talking about what he called Paisley-ontology, which was sort of like excavating what you just described as the hyper-real, but in a way that challenges and any sort of attempt to simplify it as a social construction or mental fabrication. And so one of the things that I told him was this story about how very early in the relationship with my now wife, back in 2007, she and I took acid together, and I had a kind of integral theory inspired experiment that I ran very early in the trip. I was still dealing with a very difficult dream I had, where I had gone to the Bardo between lives. I had died, and I was meeting all of my other friends in this soul cohort in the employees only lounge of some truck stop, where like the glittering world of all the distractions, there's like all the candies and stuff. Yeah. And then you get into the back, and it was like a motel room for a truck driver back there. And all my friends were so excited to go reincarnate into human existence. And I told them, I was like, I can't, you guys, like, I'm just not compatible with, human incarnation. I have to remain here in this. And it's very tragic because I loved being a human and I'm sorry I can't join you. And I sort of fainted tragically onto what I expected to be the bed. And it was just that like nasty business length carpet going up into a box. So I still fell and hit it. Yeah. And it was like this whole thing of like, well, I can't be embodied. And yet here I am still sort of like inescapably constrained by some kind of physicality that I don't completely understand and can't get along with. Right. And so I was still like struggling to make sense of this dream when she and I took this acid. And I was feeling very sort of dissociated from myself and sort of longing a deeper sense of embodiment. And I was wearing a shirt with this angel on it. There was basically like two red balloons with eyes that were just sort of like, my own sort of discarnate witnessing perspective. And she was wearing a shirt that she had screen printed with a squid on it. And I was like, oh, well, the squid, what a sensuous creature. Why don't you and I switch t-shirts and maybe I'll like catch a contact buzz off of the sensuousness that you naturally embody. And then you will get some sort of halo or whatever. And it worked. I immediately felt like I was like the Kraken.
Wow.
And who knows, like this up to this point, this could all have been just me sort of fooling myself. Yeah. But then something happened in that and a circuit had closed. And this is before I had ever read anything about egregores or tulpas or any of the class of phenomena that we're talking about here. I had that year had a series of very compelling alien encounters with a couple different groups of friends that I talk a little bit about, I think, in episode 105. But I'd be glad to, I'll tell Stu all about it on his show next week when I'm sitting in on his show. But, you and I ought to really, at some point, really dive into the like first hand encounter stuff. Yeah. But at any rate, so like after switching these shirts, I felt the sort of in the eruption or involution of like a third presence that I was immediately sure was both us and not us, that we had created and was creating us. And it appeared to me in the form of what I came to call the Angel Squid, which was like immediately like a romance precipitated a narrative of like these two, like the two shirts fell in love, but they had to meet at the surface of the water's edge. It was like a star-crossed kind of thing. But their offspring showed up like the Sentinels do to Neo in the third Matrix film, where he's seeing the Sentinels with his third eye, and they're these glorious golden cybernetic sort of subtle bodies. And I immediately recognized this also as perhaps the basis, like that was my cultural interpretation, but it could easily have been my interpretation of the same phenomenon that manifests in Hinduism as the center of the planet, the god with the 100 arms, and it felt both transcendent and also subterranean, which again, as you know, is a very persistent feature of a lot of these UFO phenomena, is that they have like underwater or underground bases. They're flying in and out of the volcano in Mexico City, etc. And my buddy Skytree, Evan Snyder, who was the original co-host for this show, is just finished an album, Infraplanetary. Yeah, so like I'll put a track from his album, his first single, at the end of this, in honor of his weird contributions to all of this. But at any rate, the Angel Squid immediately started manifesting itself in synchronicities that were very difficult to write off. We told her mother that we had sort of decided on the Angel Squid as a mascot after Google searching Angel Squid just to see what would come up, to see if it had any basis in reality. And the search results were copious and bizarrely personal. And and the thing that was most kind of memorable about that whole moment of observing this was that at the time, my iTunes, which was on shuffle, pulled up Bjork's Modern Things, in which she says, like, all of the modern things have always been there in a mountain waiting for us. You know, like, it was speaking directly to this whole thing about their autonomy, their sovereignty, that this thing sort of did, you know, transcend any kind of linear imagination to form narrative. Yeah. And it haunted us. What I did not say in episode 37 was that the Angel Squid continued to influence us for years and years. And we told my mother-in-law about it, and she, like, the next day found a pewter figurine of an angel squid, a pendant, like a squid with angel wings, at a thrift store, and bought it for us. Oh my God. And then my wife started wearing it all the time. And then I started to feel like maybe this was the unborn spirit of, like, a child that wanted to come through. And we had a lot of relationship issues for years, you know, long distance, and, you know, very difficult time of our life. And there was a long time when I wanted to banish this thing because I felt like it had more autonomy than we did, that it was holding us together against our will. And so, you know, one time I remember, this was actually 11 years ago this week, I was with some friends, and I felt for the first time, when I was without her, I felt as though this thing had sort of shown up to visit me. Like, I could sense it over my shoulder. And I was like, hey, fuck off. Wow. You know, go away. Like, I don't want you around anymore. And I had a very kind of terrifying experience where it felt like, you know, like the hooks in the tentacle of a squid had, like, wrapped into my shoulder, and I experienced physical pain from this felt presence, as though it were, like, digging in like an eagle or something into my shoulder. And it wouldn't let go until I took a pen and paper. And this sounds psychotic, but I had to take a pen and paper and write, "I'm sorry." And then the pain went away. Wow. And then, so just to wrap this story, it's like this thing has stuck around. And then years later, when I had sort of convinced myself that maybe what I should do is banish it. And this is kind of a story for another time, but Nikki and I had decided that maybe we should just sort of get back into that space, that state, and roto-root this thing out, that it was causing us problems. But then I had this other trip in 2017 where I had a kind of a stroke of insight that rather than just banishing this thing, which was clearly a part of us in some deep way, and, you know, I didn't, you know, would probably create trauma of some kind if we were to succeed in banishing it, I managed to intentionally reproduce this sort of accidental ceremony and create another one of a different kind. You know, I was just like, oh, we can just combine any two things. So that was the day that we intentionally created the unicorn owl, which had its own nexus of synchronicities around it, equally impressive and bizarre. And so, you know, I guess in a way, like, that's sort of my advice. I don't know, there's a lot of, like, potential advice in there, but, like, I guess it was interesting because it was one of these things where it's like, it was a 10-year arc of weird explorations in which it started with a mistake and it ended with a very, like, intentionally designed experiment that did actually reproduce the results. Right. You know, so
wow.
There you go.
Thank you. There's so much there. It also reminds me of Hellier. I don't know if you've watched that show.
Oh yeah, I actually mean to get the host.
Dana and
we're actually Dana. Greg actually agreed to be on Future Fossils, but I haven't followed up on that. So yeah,
I mean, theirs is a great, like, story of this mutual enactment hypothesis and just these boundaries. And what I love about the angel squid, one is just it's a hybrid, right? As is the owl unicorn. So hybridity shows up a lot because hybridity is an example of doubleness, right? And the sketch that you've given of your ongoing encounters and explorations with the angel squid, just in the last few minutes, is enough to really illustrate all the different points on the ontological spectrums that I was talking about before, right? So if we think about the station spectrum, like, this phenomena moved back and forth from subjective to interobjective, the environment showing up as synchronicities as the pin in the thrift shop, to objective to intersubjective, you know, like, so, like, it was like moving along that whole spectrum. Same with the sovereignty spectrum. Like, it was non-autonomous. Often there were semi-autonomous moments. There were times when it was autonomous and you were non-autonomous. It's like, so like you were in this dynamic process where when it had more autonomy, you had less, right? And, in different complex ways. And then with the substance spectrum, in terms of the body, right? Causal light, just more of like a high-end archetype, then subtle energetic, then grabbing you feeling it physically, and then just like the writing and, like just all those different layers, like it just highlights the multiple ways in which there is a dialogue happening between multiple types of intelligences. And maybe it's just you in deep conversation with yourself, right? In some sense, right? Because this is the other thing that shows up. I talk about three major liminal boundaries that seem to repeat in the context of doubleness. One is the inside-outside, subject, object, mind, matter. So that boundary gets all blurry. You can't tell what is what. And then there's the self-other boundary that gets all blurry, right? This also shows up with channelers. Like a lot of times channelers who have been at it for a while, at a certain point, they realize and start to share with their audiences that the main entity they're channeling is actually a future version of themselves from another timeline in another dimension, right? And that's partly why they're able to channel that being, because there's like a karmic soul link between that being and themselves. And so they kind of have more access to connect with that version of themselves, right? And so what's interesting here is, like, on the one hand, it's a separate entity that lives on another timeline, another dimension, totally separate, and yet it's also you, another version of yourself. So it's like, where do you draw that line? Like, what's you, what's not you? So the self-other boundary is one of the liminal boundaries of doubleness. And then the third, which could also be 3 and 4, is basically time and space. That time and space gets all wacky and weird, right? And so essentially this is like the I, we, and it of liminal boundaries, right? Like, and so in this sense, it's like Wilber's quadrants just become this, like they get so intermixed, and it's just like what ends up. It's like when you're a scuba diver and you're about 50 feet down and you get disoriented, you don't know which way to go to get up, right? So this Angel Squid example is so fascinating because it really highlights all these different ways in which these dynamics of realness are at play. And you can't really even understand it by approaching it from, is it real or unreal? That doesn't even honor the phenomenon. There's somehow it's I don't even know how to describe it. It's kind of like real, but then question mark. What are we talking about? Like, what is this? What is the nature, the ontological nature of the angel squid, or the owl unicorn? It's so cool.
Yeah. So, just because I guess it's worth mentioning that, like I said, I always felt that this entity, I suspected that this entity might be some kind of emanation of, or instance of, or, prophecy of a child that we, in some sense, expected or were felt like we were supposed to have, and that was sort of where its autonomy was constraining us. Right. And then the unicorn owl, I felt very strongly immediately after running that particular experiment that we had sort of shifted things from an emphasis on a child that we were not having, and it was attached to this painful history of possible futures that we never achieved, to a child that we still could have. And that I felt like, instead of it being a male child, it's now a female child. And I felt very strongly immediately upon having that experience, we're gonna have a little girl. And then we did. And the first day I went to the art supply store after she was born, I found a beanie baby of a unicorn owl with like a glittery gold horn. And we had moved to New Mexico in order to have this child, and the little tag on the thing said that its name was Enchanted, as in like the land of enchantment, and that it was born on 3/25, which was like precisely between when she was due and when she was actually born.
Oh, wow.
And, what?
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I guess this is all to say that, like you have already noted, there is a temporal dimension to a lot of these experiences, and I've been watching Dark on Netflix, which I guess you've seen it.
The first season,
oh my God. It continues to become like the most intricate Celtic knot of temporal interrelationships that I have ever seen in any kind of narrative form. And it really speaks to this whole idea of the time loop and like future events causing past events, so that the only way you can understand it is to sort of like slice through it orthogonally and look at it all of time as occurring at once, that there is like the eternal dimension in which all of the, past, present, and future are simultaneous. And so I'm really curious what your thoughts are on that, because ostensibly this is a show about time. And that feels like a good place to, like, when I say like, let's tie a bow on it, I guess what I mean is let's tie, a bow made of time loop Mobius strips on this conversation, with your thoughts on that very thing, on the way that so many of these UFO encounters are about the denizens of potential futures coming back into what we think of as our present in order to affect themselves.
Yeah, and that's a very common theme that shows up over and over again in a lot of different ways, to the point where you have to take it seriously. You have to really open up. And so many of our best movies, and like you're saying with Dark, like, are the ones that play with time, because I think there's a way in which we recognize those films and those literatures are like portals into a deeper resonant understanding of the loopiness of time. And so we're drawn to it for some reason, and it's like also like this example of the Angel Squid is like this fascinating multidimensional object, right? And both in time and space. And like on the one hand, it might have started out as like some kind of like hybrid archetype. And then it like took on a tulpa-esque quality. And then like some other entity like inhabited that energetic form to like engage and play and enjoy. And then like your potential unborn son connected to it. And then, so it's kind of like, it's not that the Angel Squid is a singular phenomena in time and space. It's almost like it is a container for potentially between 2 and 10 different types of non-human intelligences dancing with each other at different points. And then at a certain point it flipped. And then it's, the hit I got was the owl unicorn, was because that was then the daughter that was born, not the son. That's the, Angel Squid. Right. And so then that's weird and interesting, kind of like what was going on with that, and so I think, and there's this great book by Eric Wargo of time loops.
We had him on the show. It's actually the most popular episode of Future Fossils by download count. Yeah.
Wow. Awesome. Yeah. So and like, and that is just fascinating. That's like, especially like when you look at like the micro time loops, like, because we often think of time loops and kind of these bigger, like the aliens coming from 1,000 years in the future, coming back to try and save humanity, which is themselves from some environment. We often think of time loops in these really big temporal horizons, but I think just as fascinating, if not more, is the micro time loops and the ways in which that's happening on much smaller scales all the time. And then if you kind of extrapolate that out to the large, like it's just like it's a total clusterfuck. So I think time and space is just wacky. And this is why, whether you're talking about the fairy abductions, fairy lore, or UFO abductions, or people encounter like almost many encounters with the paranormal involve time dilation in one direction or another, as well as weird space things happening. So the fact that the paranormal seems to be completely wrapped up with time and space, and that the realities of these phenomena seem to be intricately tied to time loops and space loops, I think to me is part of the, I don't know, it's like the puncture into the nature of reality, that like they're that these things are overlapping concurrently and simultaneously, and like we are in a simulation. But who cares? Like, I have the experience of loving my daughters. To me, that is exquisite, right? I have the experience of heartbreak, from past relationships. I have the experience of being, a face plant when Meta Integral fell apart in 2015. Like I don't care that I'm in a simulation because this is fascinating. Like, this is really good, like, and even if free will is an illusion, like, well, I can do my meditation practice and I can have the experience of, objectifying my habitual patterns and being more free of them. So like, if that's all part of the simulation, so be it. Right. So I find the whole like simulation thing, like, because it's like when we say it's a simulation, in a way, what we're saying is this is fake. Right. But it's not. This is real, even if it's a simulation, right? We get back to the hypo-real, right? Where the copy and the original, like, which one's more real? Like, is it the simulation less real because it's a simulation? Like, why is it we feel like somehow we're getting the raw end of the deal if we're in a simulation? Like, why not be like, this is the lottery, man. We're in a simulation. Like, this is like totally fascinating, right? I don't get a sense that we're limited in terms of the rules of the simulation. Like, I get we're, walking, zombies in terms of our habitual patterns and our delusions. But even within that, there's interesting creative agency that seems possible. So I don't know. I'm willing to pony up and put another, round in and see what happens.
That's, I think, why I can't stop talking about it. Blade Runner 2049 is such a radical film in terms of its treatment of personhood and who deserves human rights. Right. Because, the first movie, it's like, it has that very naive real, non-real distinction. And, even Phil Dick was like, no, the replicants are not human beings, right. But then Blade Runner 2049 turns that all on its head. And you don't only get your character as a Blade Runner and a replicant, but you get that he's in a relationship with a hologram that doesn't even have a body, okay. And that ends up being the most beautiful, heartfelt relationship in the entire film, the most human relationship, more human than any of the relationships in the film that you see between legal humans.
Right.
And so this is exactly, to your point about how it's time for us to expand these definitions. I guess where I'd like to end this is since I've put myself under the wheels of whatever critical truck might roll into this conversation, I tend to ask people at the end of these episodes to engage in a sort of imaginative exercise about a conversation with their future self. But something tells me that you actually have these conversations. Right. And I'm curious if you're willing to share any of that.
Yeah, I will.
What kind of experiences you've had firsthand with, a dialogue with future Sean or Sean's, future possible Sean's, whatever, however you do that.
Yeah, great. We'll end on a doozy here. Before I go into that, I'll just say that this, just building on what you're saying right before you gave that invitation about talking with my future self, what came to me is the sense of this is what I am excited about with the post-truth era, because I feel the post-truth era is actually deconstructing our real, unreal frame. And as frustrating and kind of disorienting as the post-truth, and there's a lot of downside to it, if I was to point to a potential upside, is that I think it paves the way towards a multidimensional reality, right? Or at least it has that potentiality, right? And that there's a way in which it's forcing us to reconsider what is real and how do we defend what is real and how do we even identify what is real. And I don't think the ultimate response or answer to that is going back to a scientific materialism that has ruled the day for the last 300 to 600 years. I think that might be the case initially, like with COVID, where we have to kind of run back to good old science to kind of figure things out. I think the bigger play is that post-truth is opening up to multidimensionality. And I think part of that's because we're also moving into a galactic era as humans. And so I think there's, when you talk about the exponential growth of AI and other things that are happening right now in surveillance states, I think we're headed towards an understanding of the real in a multidimensional way. So that being said, yes, I've had an experience in a kind of a meditative mode where I connected with what I consider a parallel self. That was the experience that was happening. It was like, if I was to try and describe what it was like It was a parallel self, but what was confusing was it was a mantis being and on a ship, and that the mantis being that I was connecting with as myself had lived for several thousand years and was going to live for several more thousand years. So at the same time, in relationship to Sean, the embodied ego, this was a past life as well as a future life. Because myself, as the mantis being, the lifespan is much bigger than the 70 to 120 years that I'm going to have. So it was a very interesting experience to connect with this parallel self who has a very different embodied physical energetic existence in terms of a lifespan that totally messes with my sense of my own lifespan, right? So to connect with a being that was simultaneously a present parallel self, a past self, and a future self to this incarnation. And then the other thing that came through in that encounter, and in a sense that kind of, I wouldn't say a conversation, but it was kind of like this mind meld thing, was that myself as the mantis being is in a sense is a non-contracted expression of awareness, whereas Sean as an embodied being on this planet is struggling between moments of being really contracted and moments of being free and open and grounded and present. And so there was a way in which it was like connecting with a more enlightened self. And so it was also strange to in a sense, feel how fucked up I am as Sean, and how compared to this other expression of myself, which really doesn't have any of that garbage or those dynamics or those tensions or contradictions in it in the same way. That's not to say that as the mantis being, I don't have shadow or other, growing edges or something. I don't know. But there was like something in the juxtaposition of feeling how as this, and then it was also the sense of triangulating and realizing that I was actually, I'm not just the mantis being, but I'm more than the mantis being. That there's this, what you might call an oversoul that actually chooses to incarnate and manifest through multiple embodied expressions, one of which is a multi-centennial, 1,000-year-old, mantis being, and one is me right now. And so it was also interesting to just get this sense of realizing that in my purest state, I'm totally not contracted. And yet in my embodied experience here, I go in and out of contraction all the time. So there was just something fascinating about that. It was like realizing that I'm already enlightened and I'm totally not enlightened, right? Like there's some aspects of my soul nature that transcend this particular biographical journey that I'm on. And as per so much of the literature, it's like I'm in this journey because there's actually something very powerful about being contracted and about struggling with that and trying to overcome that and being compassionate towards other people in the face of their contractions, right? And having my own contractions as a way of understanding why other people have their contractions, right? So it was a really bizarre experience of kind of connecting with my future, past, present, non-self. So I'll leave it at that.
That's a great place to leave it. Yeah. I love it. Sean, thank you for joining me for this and us for this slice of our frequently contracted journey through a vector that, may or may not be wrapped around on itself and is not. And your work is, I think, as I've said several times already, just really, really useful for people who have been, like myself, trying very, very hard to make sense of these experiences for a very long time and struggling with an unfortunate tendency to attempt to reduce it to one thing or another, and I really hope that the listeners of the show are inspired to follow you on your continued explorations of this. Where would you send people if they want to go deeper with you on this?
Yeah, so thank you. It's always a pleasure to dance with you, Michael, in our multidimensional selves. And yeah, for people who want to connect or, dive into what I'm doing, they can go to EXO studies, .org. And there's, a number of things there, including, the paper that I've just mentioned, the Our Wild Kosmos, so people can download that. I'm also starting a year-long program in September on exo studies where we're going through these 42 crazy topics. So you can see what those topics are and what the books are that I'll be drawing from. And then for people who are interested in my other more conventional work in working with multiple forms of capital and creating new economic models, that can be found at metaintegral.com. So thank you, Michael. Really good to be here with you tonight.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean.
Cheers.
Thanks again for listening, everybody. We covered a lot of ground in that episode, but I want to call back to a couple other future fossils that we mentioned, including episode 37 with Michelangelo, episodes 60 and 113 with Sean Esbjörn-Hargens, episode 91 with my science fiction story and oral history of the end of reality, episode 117 with Eric Wargo on time loops, and the last episode we did, 149, with Dare Sohei and Tada Hazumi and Naomi Most on cultural somatics, which gets a little bit more into this issue of the egregore or the tulpa and this question of mutual enactment. We go really deep with that, and I deeply enjoyed that conversation. Also, I had a number of really excellent episodes of Future Fossils with J.F. Martell, co-host of the Weird Studies podcast, on which I appeared in episode 26. And JF and Phil Ford were on Future Fossils for 126 of this show. So if you really want to go deeper into the weird, that's a great place to start, as well as episodes 99 and 132 with Eric Davis, one of the high priests of Weird Studies. He is just one of my great inspirations, and it's been a pleasure to have him go into his work and his MIT Press book, High Weirdness, on Future Fossils. Again, feel free to reach out to me at any time, Twitter, Instagram, or email. I hope to see you in the Future Fossils Discord server or in our conversation on patreon.com/Michael Garfield. And with that, I'm going to ring you out with a new tune by my friend and original Future Fossils co-host, Evan Skytree Snyder, who is just about to release his first new LP in some time. He's one of my favorite electronic musicians, and his new album, Infraplanetary, is very, very apropos as a sign-off for that awesome conversation. So here you are. Enjoy the first single off of Skytree's new album, Infraplanetary, which you can pre-order at skytree.bandcamp.com. Thanks again for listening, everyone, and enjoy.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's. Across an immense ethereal gulf, minds that are to our minds as our minds are to the beasts in the jungle. Vast, cool intellects. The creation of life anywhere in the universe would be more the rule than the exception. In that case, there may be others. Intelligent civilizations capable of communicating with us.